Namaste and welcome back to Waking Up with Mindful Serenity. Today I like to talk a little bit more on truth. I know I answered there. I pulled that concept from the jar a few days ago and I did a little spiel on it, as perfect as it was. But I also want to talk about, and I never had the opportunity to, because of the time frame, to talk about how do we get to the truth. So we always say, we need to find the truth, we need to realize self, that's the answer, but how do we get there, right? That's a big issue for many of us. How on earth do we get that knowing that we are what we are, so to speak? So I like to read something that came from a lecture from Vivekananda when he was touring the States in 1894, doing a series of lectures called the Harmony of Religions lectures. And during these lectures, he was quoted as saying this on the topic of how do we find truth. Things have been perceived and realized and then written. This world spoke to the early thinkers. Birds spoke to them, animals spoke to them, the sun and the moon spoke to them, and little by little, they realized things and got into the heart of nature. Not by cogitation, not by the force of logic, not by picking the brains of others and making a big book, as is the fashion in modern times. Not even as I do, by taking up one of their writings and making a long lecture, but by patient investigation and discovery, they found out the truth. It is practice first and knowledge afterwards. So we can read all we want to about self-realization, about becoming who we are and enlightenment and how to get to that state and all that. We can read it, talk to others or listen to others who have been there. We can, study, as I have done and as I like to do over the last 25 plus years, almost 30 years now. I've been studying yoga and going through the ancient scriptures from the East, not just yoga, but all things related to yoga. Yoga, of course, is not a religion and it's really not denominational, and it encompasses all religious and all spiritual ideas as far as I'm concerned, and all intellectual ideas as well, because it is a science of the mind. But that being said, I've done a lot of studying. Did I get further through self-realization with my studying? No. When I got heavier into my practice, I probably got a little closer. And my practice, again, I will remind you, it's not just what I do on a meditation cushion twice a day. And it's not just the hatha yoga classes I teach and, the sequences I do on my own. It is not even the karma yoga, my acts of service, so has a lot to do with that. It is how I respond to every moment of my life. So my practice occurs from the time I wake up until the time I go to bed at night. The major portion of my practice is my interaction with life, right? And I learn and I try to observe myself and watch myself so that I can see what's going on. That practice is the same practice, basically, that the rishis took part in, the seven, original rishis in yoga. Thousands and thousands of years ago, they went into caves and they began to do what Yogananda called, enter the laboratory of soul research. They went inwards and start looking and experiencing what it is they wanted to know. So there was no stuff written back then about yoga, right? They were the originals. So what they did, and they didn't write books about them. In fact, it took many centuries later before people start writing down in sutras what these masters were saying. They themselves never wrote the books or did they actually teaching. People just, wrote down what they thought they were saying, and they became sutras. But the real practice was going inward and experiencing. Like we go inward and experience during meditation. We examine our minds, we examine our thoughts, we examine what is that behind the mind? who am I, that meditation, and we do all that, and that's part of the practice. I can read about that, and I can read about that until I'm blue in the face, but that is not going to get me to where I want to go. I have to practice. I have to go in. I have to see what's going on in there. And more importantly, I have to take it out of the cave or off the meditation cushion and out there in the real world where it will be tested the most, right? And that's practice. Part of practice is testing what we're learning. And we have to go out and see how I'm responding now when that person says that to me 10 years ago. It bothered me. Does it still bother me as much now? Do I notice what thoughts are going through my head as this happens? Can I see now how I am reacting to a trigger, to a samskara, not necessarily what that person is doing? Am I seeing now how insignificant it is what that person is doing? This is an internal game. How far am I there? How less bothered am I by this? How more peaceful and giving am I? How much more compassionate am I than I used to be? And I mean real compassion, not pity. How much more loving of myself am I? Am I still trampling down myself to get to self with a capital S? Or am I learning that this self, this ego, is a part of who I am, and I need to embrace it and allow it to be released on its own instead of trying to trample over it so I can get to something better? How am I learning? That is the practice. The practice is an inward practice mostly, but it's also a practice. How do I take what I'm learning, what I'm reading, what I'm hearing, and applying it to my life every day? And that is the practice. When he says it's a practice first and knowledge afterwards, then true knowledge comes. We talk about the fourth kasha that the Vedics, the Veda Vandanas and whatever have ascribed to. We see that in that fourth kasha is the jhana body, the wisdom body. It's not a conceptualized learning. It has nothing to do with cognition or cogitation or by the force of logic. It's not by picking the brains of others and making a big book or lecturing about what others have said. It is about experiencing that knowing for ourselves. And that's what will take us into that higher consciousness. Knowledge is good, but not as great as practice. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you for joining me. Namaste.